Hey friends, if you clicked on this video because you're trying to figure out whether or not you're autistic, well, you're in the right place. Now, I know, I've made loads of videos about the signs that you are actually autistic. But what if you're not? What if you're actually a secret neurotypical? Quick pause. I want to make it super clear that this video is meant to be informative, maybe even entertaining, but it's not a substitute for a professional assessment should you need or want one. Self-identification is valid for many good reasons, and I've linked my videos on this topic in the description box below if you want to see them. Theme 1, social success and ease of communication. Let's start with the most obvious signs. Social success. After all, autism is primarily defined by differences in how we experience and navigate social situations, but what if you're someone who naturally gets it when it comes to socialising? Did you start school, making a group of friends on day one and just breezing through group activities? Or did you manage to fit in without the feelings of not understanding how groups of other people just get on with each other? Maybe you managed to figure it all out on your own without the written manual that a lot of autistic people wish that they had as a kid. Something to explicitly explain all of the unwritten rules of social interactions. But even with a manual, that still wouldn't take away from intellectualizing every step. It took me 3 years of high school before I made any friends, but as an adult, I know how it's done. It's just that in person, I'm constantly thinking about the interaction. I'm intellectualizing every step. I'm trying to make sure that I'm paying attention, but that I look like I'm paying attention. There's different things. And that I'm matching someone else's energy, and that I'm not just standing or sitting in a weird way, or that I'm not making too much eye contact or talking too much. Even as an adult, there's very rarely been a time where I've been able to just let my hair down, so to speak, up, I don't know, down, and just enjoy other people's company without having to run through all of these processes, and it's really tiring. These processes, trying to fit in by suppressing autistic behaviours like stimming or meeting certain neurotypical standards for communication, like keeping it very shallow and professionally back and forth, sort of like tennis players at Wimbledon. Well, that is called masking. Everybody masks to some extent, even neurotypicals, but when you got home from school or work, did you find yourself looking forward to spending time with your friends and family and wanting to go out and do more socialising in order to recharge from the day? Because if that's you, then you might not be autistic. Generally, autistic people, even extroverted ones, need significant alone time to recharge their batteries. Even the most socially skilled autistic people often find that extended social interaction takes a toll, requiring dedicated downtime to process and recover. If you're someone who genuinely feels energized by constant social interaction, then that could be a sign that you're not autistic. If you're the kind of person who can just follow along with multi-person conversations, if you're the kind of person, maybe you can follow along with multi-person conversations and keep track of what everyone's saying and still maintain, still pass as neurotypical, or try to, or maybe you think you do, but you don't actually, then it's possible that you might not be autistic. Eye contact is an interesting one because it's one of those things that you have to get just right in order to be accepted. Too much or too little, and you might arouse suspicion. Worse, you might be thought of as some sort of weirdo. I think the reason this is super interesting is because whether or not you pull off the perfect eye contact score depends entirely on which country you were born in or raised in, because eye contact, like the autistic diagnostic criteria, is predominantly American flavoured. Now, there is a flip side to this. Halfway through my high school years, I eventually became friends with a small group of other people who probably struggled making friends themselves. I'm going to say they had a high chance of being autistic. They were the people who didn't feel like they belonged in any of the other pre-made groups. And spending time with them was great. I enjoyed it. The feeling of being watched or judged just seems lesser in neurodivergent or openly autistic groups. In 2012, Dr. Milton coined the phrase the double empathy problem, which is about the crossed communication that results from different neurotypes having different social needs and communication styles. The social exhaustion that comes from interacting with neurotypical people often just disappears when we're in with other neurodivergent folks who understand and accept our natural way of being. Theme 2, sensory sensitivity and overload. While we're working on the more obvious features of being non-autistic, let's talk about lacking sensory overload. If you're someone who can just walk into a loud room full of bright fluorescent lights and not feel like your brain is going to explode, chances are you might not be autistic. For us, the wrong sensory input can feel like a sensory grenade went off in our brains. But if you're cool in those situations, good for you. My first weekend retail job gave me headaches every day. But it wasn't until decades later that I connected the dots and realised that flickering fluorescent tubes were the cause. These cheap flickering, buzzing tubes were basically the only source of lighting in public places in the UK in the 1990s. So schools, public buildings, hospitals, all the indoor spaces where people are. It wasn't until my 30s that I realised that these things just didn't bother other people like they did me. It wasn't until my 40s that I realised that this could be a fairly common autistic experience, and electrical noise and flickering lights aren't in the diagnostic criteria. Maybe when the DSM-6 drops, I can imagine an old, flickery fluorescent light tube being added to the diagnostic box of tricks. Maybe it can go into the same little velvet bag as the childhood toys and that book on flying toads on lily pads. What about sensitivity to sounds, especially those unexpected sounds or textures? The worst for me were the mass-produced school uniforms with the scratchy seams. It made me feel like I was wearing a sweater filled with ants. Now imagine that at school every day, I was told that I was being difficult and unreasonable, and that everyone else was fine with it, so why shouldn't I be? Sometimes the soft hum from the back of a fridge or a TV can mess with our moods or make us physically uncomfortable at home. Now, all that stuff the diagnostic criteria lumps in as hyper or hypo-reactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. I call it turn the damn lights off or I'll unplug them. So while the general concept of sensory differences is in the criteria, the specific examples I mentioned, like fluorescent lights and scratchy clothing, these things aren't explicitly listed as examples. And it'd be great if they were. This is part of why autism can be so complex to diagnose, as not everyone has these experiences and they can present differently in different people. And by the way, one thinking about it, you don't need to have any sensory differences compared to a neurotypical at all to be formally diagnosed autistic. It's one of the either-or categories. If you're interested in the details, I have made a video deep diving into how the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for autism works. Linked in the description. If I mention a video, it's linked in the description. Theme 3, masking and internalised ableism. Now let's dig into masking. If you've never had to mask your true self to fit in, you're probably not autistic. Because masking is when we hide who we are in order to blend in with the crowd. It's exhausting. If you don't do that, if you feel like you can just be yourself without any fear of judgment, good for you, but that's another sign of being neurotypical. Some autistic people describe masking as a survival strategy. Some others consider it an optional skill that can be learned. Maybe it's a bit of both. I made a video about some of the ways that I stim or self-regulate. And stimming is a weird word and it sounds sexual, but just like sexuality, stimming in a public place can sometimes unnerve people. Now, I tend to focus on pressure on certain areas of my body, or I move myself in ways that people consider strange. I might rock or spin, or what I have now I've learned is called flapping my hands. It's not weird, I promise. Here's Bill Gates, former richest man in the world, last week talking about doing similar things.
You know, I have a behavior where I rock that bothers people, but that's also common, so-called self-stimming type things.
Sometimes stimming helps me focus. I write and record all of my videos. I'm moving. I'm moving my legs, you can't tell. I might be bouncing a leg or two. Even during live streams or meetings when I'm working, it helps me to focus. When I've given presentations, I tend to move around on the stage, and people have commented to me that it makes it difficult to follow along while they're watching me move. Like, if there's all that space, why are you not supposed to use it? You're supposed to just stand still, apparently. I'm not sure I could do it. Like, standing still on a spot, like a vicar at a funeral. Like, I couldn't do it. Everyone self-soothes to a degree with movements or pressure, or what are called stereotypies. If you've ever twiddled your hair while you're thinking, or tapped your fingers on a desk, or bounced your leg during a meeting, these are all forms of stimming. The difference is that society tends to accept these normal stims, while judging the ones, like I mentioned earlier, kind of more harshly. I mean, the ones associated with autism, like flapping, spinning, or rocking, or anything other than the few socially government-approved stims are treated with some weird disdain. It's a double standard that just highlights how arbitrary these social rules are. Many autistic people have been bullied or discriminated against or feel the need to sort of self-police themselves in order to not do these movements and to behave more normally, air quotes. I feel this way literally all of the time. If you're someone who can just be yourself without constantly monitoring and adjusting your behaviour, that might be another sign that you're not autistic. For many of us, it's like having an internal behaviour police, always watching, always criticising, always making sure that we're not too autistic in public. It's exhausting, but sometimes it becomes such a habit that we don't even realise that we're doing it to ourselves. Think about your average day. Can you just walk into a store, have a conversation with the cashier, and leave without analysing every word and gesture that you made during that interaction? If so, you might not be autistic. For many of us, even these brief encounters have become complicated social equations that we have to solve, often replaying them in our minds hours or days later, wondering if we did it all right or not. And then there is the internalised ableism, something a lot of autistic people don't realise that we have. We sometimes hold ourselves to impossible standards based on what we think society expects from us. If you've never felt like you're not enough or that something's wrong with you, then you're probably not autistic. For instance, if you've never been told to just try harder, you're being lazy, make better eye contact or whatever, or everyone feels that way sometimes, even when you're discussing problems that you have or sensory overload, or maybe the you don't look autistic, that old chestnut, well, this dismisses our struggles, and it's a form of ableism that neurotypical people rarely encounter themselves. While neurotypical people might face other challenges, they don't typically experience the specific kind of discrimination that comes from being neurodivergent in a neurotypical-centered world. Similarly, if you've never had your legitimate needs dismissed as attention-seeking or invalidated, like you should just get over it when experiencing sensory overwhelm, that in itself might be another sign that you're not autistic. Because these experiences of having our genuine challenges invalidated or minimised are unfortunately really common among autistic people. But it's not something, generally, that neurotypical people typically face. I hope that makes sense. Theme 5. Identity crisis and self-acceptance. I've been heavily involved in the autism online space for the last couple of years, and my military-grade autism, it's a bit janky, but it has noticed some patterns. Because it seems that so many people went through what I can only describe as an existential crisis. That is, where you wonder if you might be autistic or not, and you start to put the pieces together. Now for me, it was after completely burning myself out that I started to try and figure out what was quote-unquote wrong with me. I had some fantastic experiences, but I burnt out on them. How does that work? How can you burn out doing happy things? So I'm starting to put together all my evidence, so to speak, and it wasn't until much later on that I found out that this was actually quite a common autistic experience. Self-identification isn't from just watching a TikTok video and trying on autism like it's a trendy new sweater. It looks more like my mind map or the binder filled with pages that so many of us have before we even think about booking an assessment. Neurotypicals don't generally go through this process. You don't tend to find blokes in Britain sitting around the pub telling each other about how they might or might not be autistic. Whereas on the other hand, in places like my Discord server, we do have conversations about diagnosis, and it's unbelievably refreshing to communicate and learn from other neurodivergent people's experiences. I didn't have the benefit of talking to other autistic people before I had booked my autism assessment, and I was stressed out, and I wished I had. I'm not saying that neurotypicals never have existential crises. I mean, they have the midlife crisis, so I'm not saying that they don't question everything that they think they know about themselves from time to time, but I'm saying that they don't generally start collecting evidence that they might be autistic in secret little folders and notebooks or apps on their phones. Have I called you out? Let me know in the comments below. I think I probably have, because if you were diagnosed or identified earlier in life, perhaps as a child, you might not relate to what I'm saying here, and that is okay. Many late diagnosed autistic people experience this huge shift in identity, and it's intense. And if this hasn't happened to you, well, you might not be autistic. Of course, you could still be autistic and not relating to this. You just might not know it yet. Theme 6, interests. If you're the type of person who has a wide variety of hobbies and interests and you're constantly changing them, it might be a sign of ADHD, honestly. Which you could be, in addition to being an autistic adult. What I'm talking about here is that autistic people often have deep, focused and intense interests that they can lose themselves in for hours, days, or even years. These aren't your average interests, they're more like deep passions, and sometimes they can border on obsession. But where neurotypicals might casually enjoy a range of hobbies, for many autistic people, it's the singular, laser-focused precision, that passion, that keeps us hooked. It's like we can enjoy doing the thing or thinking about the thing all day. When I was little, I spent all my time thinking about computers, and it could easily have been trains instead, but it's computers, and computers are marine creatures. My obsessive interest in technology has meant that not only have I enjoyed learning programming languages, but I've had a varied career in computer science and technology. I'm former Microsoft. I've built systems for the NHS that are still foundational today. Everything from sexual health and diabetic retinopathy and blood transfusion. I've built my own software and licensed my own intellectual property. I've been really lucky. Underlying my paid work has been an obsessive interest in tech. And I thought I could hide in this field, but as I progressed, it meant my schedule filled more with meetings and people stuff than it did on the deep work that I loved. But I never chose my interest. Computers and tech is a so-called classic autism interest, and perhaps that helped in my identification and subsequent diagnosis. Actually, it wasn't perhaps. There is a ton of evidence that I emailed in, and it was used. My interests could have been something else that society just didn't appreciate or value. It could have been fascination with some historical event, or fashion, or poetry. No shade, by the way. I'm just saying that during the 2000s, my special interests were in peak demand, and they paid well. Even if I was terrible with money, personal organisation, and life, and had my first big financial crash in 2008, but another time. I also enjoy the marine world. I learned to scuba dive about 10 years ago, and whether it's scuba or just free diving and snorkeling, it's fantastically regulating. I've been involved in supporting research and scientific projects, and it's meant that I've met and worked with some amazing people in the environmental and nature space, but I've not yet met Chris Packham, so if you're watching, Chris, give me a call. Actually, no, email, better. Theme 7, routine and structure. Let's talk about routine. There's a misconception that autistic people must follow rigid schedules, but that's not always true. When I first thought about autism and routines, I was like, hold on, this isn't me. I don't have a strict minute-by-minute planner. Or I don't schedule my day down to the second or whatever. That's what I thought anyway. For example, when I plan my trips, whether for work or fun, I don't write down every detail. I just make sure that I've got a rough idea about where I need to be and when and what I can eat, that sort of thing. There's a difference between schedules and routines. Schedules are strict timetables, whereas routines are flexible patterns that become natural over time. For autistic folks, routines provide comfort without requiring rigid adherence. For example, my morning tea is simple and automatic, while my coffee ritual is more elaborate. These routines create structure and predictability in my day. Just like my diving preparations help me feel grounded, if I have a dive planned for 4 p.m, I'm preparing at lunchtime, far in advance. And I have my own ways to ensure that I'm ready to go on time with everything working and in place. These are all my little routines, and it can be utterly frustrating when something isn't right, or unexpectedly goes missing, or not to plan. Routines serve different purposes for different people. For many autistic people, they help manage anxiety and conserve that mental energy, that battery, for more complicated tasks that require more careful thinking, spending time with people, doing activities, whatever. They're like mental shortcuts that free up our minds. When facing decisions or changes, routines can help reduce overthinking. They provide automatic patterns that don't require constant analysis. Does all of this make sense? I'm sure it does. I'm probably waffling too much. If you can easily handle daily activities, then without set patterns, you might not be autistic. But if you find security in predictable routines, that could indicate an autistic trait. Remember, routines aren't restrictions, they're tools that make life more manageable. They provide stability in an overwhelming world. If you need routines to navigate daily life more easily, this might suggest you're autistic. You might have routines, you might have quite a lot of routines, and not know. Bear that in mind. Before you rush off and think, oh, I must be neurotypical, you might have a whole bunch of routines and not even realise. Theme 8, cognitive and behaviour challenges. I'd like to mention meltdowns and shutdowns for a moment. Behavioural or emotional challenges. These are often what people think of when they're thinking about autism. It's one of TikTok's top search terms relating to autism. But I haven't had a meltdown for a really long time, and I rarely even shut down these days, so am I even autistic? I previously responded to Dr. K from HealthyGamerGG on the topic of conflating tantrums and meltdowns, as though autistic people's most emotionally distressed reactions are done as a form of manipulation, rather than an overflow of energy from being overstimulated or stressed and not having the sufficient means at that time to cool down. My friend Quinn from Autistic posted a beautifully detailed video on this subject that is much better to watch directly, and I'm not going to rehash it here, but I'd like to add, it all comes down to environment. Environment is everything when it comes to meltdowns, shutdowns, and other related aspects of the autistic experience of just living in a world that wasn't built for you. I don't have to deal with uncomfortable clothes, complicated groups and meetings. I mean, sure, sometimes I do, but not every day. Noise-cancelling headphones and sunglasses both help me too, allowing myself to move in ways that are more comfortable and regulating. Also helps a lot. My environment is far from ideal, but it's better than it used to be. And if I didn't have the ability to retreat to my oasis, again, another video, lots of references to earlier videos here, and if I can't just do that and just shut the world away on a regular basis, then I would be a problem for society to solve. If you don't struggle with your environment, your places of education, work, or third places like shops or malls, the average neurotypical doesn't, by the way, then you might not be autistic. I'm going to talk about this more very soon, so do stay in touch with my channel by stimming the subscribe button if you haven't yet, and thank you to everyone who has. Do you ever find it easy to let things go and not continue to affect you? One of the problems with doom scrolling social media for me is that I'll see something harmful to animals or even set up situations of, faked pet rescues. Something like that can upset me for hours or sometimes even days. And I know it's not rational and there's nothing I can do in the moment to help, and that helplessness just upsets me more. How's that for a lack of empathy? Many autistic individuals find themselves deeply challenged by letting go of situations or experiences in your mind, particularly those that clash with your deeply held moral values or sense of justice. Autistic people, we tend not to just think about these things, we often obsess over them, analysing every detail, considering every angle, replaying conversations and scenarios in our minds. These thought patterns can persist for days, weeks, even months, becoming endless loops of mental replay and analysis. And if you don't ever find yourself caught in these persistent thought cycles, that could be an indicator that you might not be autistic. Sometimes these thought patterns can be quite helpful when they align with my work or hobbies, but sometimes they really aren't helpful when I've got conversations from 3 months ago replaying in my mind when I need that space for other things. It seems to me that autistic people, or neurodivergent people in general, can tend to fixate, and that neurotypical folks can tend to find it easier to move on by comparison. Theme 9, burnout. Let's talk about burnout, a topic that's all too familiar for many autistic people. Burnout isn't just being tired, it's a whole other level of exhaustion. It's the kind of fatigue where even the simplest tasks feel impossible. It's like your brain has been running on overdrive for too long and now it's completely out of juice. For me, burnout often happens after prolonged exposure to things that drain my mental and emotional energy. It's not just the physical tiredness that makes me want to collapse into bed after a busy week, it's the mental wear and tear. It's dealing with endless demands without break, reprieve. Over time it builds up and then one day it just hits. It's not a choice and it's not something that you can just push through. Autistic burnout is different from what many people think of as a typical fatigue or maybe even depression. When we experience burnout, we often find it hard to do even basic things like eating, showering or answering emails. It's like our brains hit a wall and everything just feels like it's in slow motion. The energy that we would normally have to mask and socialise and navigate the world just simply disappears. And we need the time and the space to recover, and sometimes that means completely disconnecting for some time. If you've ever found yourself needing to shut down or withdraw completely, that's a sign of burnout. And it's also important to note that burnout can be misinterpreted by others, especially by neurotypical people who might expect us to just snap out of it, but it can take some time, like I said. There's no quick fix. And if you've ever experienced burnout, you might find that you're not just physically drained, but that your emotions and your mind is just cloudy. So then, if socializing doesn't leave you feeling drained and ready to collapse into your bed for 3 days, then you might not be autistic. A lot of autistic people call it a social battery or a limited social battery, or the spoon theory is sometimes mentioned. I prefer spell slots, honestly, but it gets depleted fast, and once it's gone, we need a lot of time to recharge. If you're the type to socialize all day and still feel fine afterwards, then you might not be autistic. Theme 10, health and co-occurring conditions. Now, autism is not a mental illness or a mental health condition. Autism is not an intellectual disability, and autism is not a disease. It's not an epidemic or a trend. Now that we've got that all out of the way, let's talk about co-occurring conditions that sometimes come along with autism. Think of it like a package or a meal deal, but instead of crisps or chips, you get sand. Autism co-occurs with hypermobility, sometimes called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, epilepsy. We often have gastrointestinal issues, sleep and insomnia problems, anxiety and stress. A lot of this stuff can often co-occur. I don't want to say comorbid. So morbid means death, but like a lot of this stuff co-occurs with autism. But for a lot of autistic people, health conditions like anxiety, sleep disorders, and gastrointestinal issues are common. Rather interestingly, some emerging research seems to suggest that things such as GI issues are not physiologically linked with autism, but with anxiety and stress, which can then inflame GI issues. I'll be talking more about these things in a future video, but if your health is pretty much perfect, then autism might not be there. None of this is diagnostic, and I usually do show the evidence on this channel, but one of the diagnostic criteria for autism is that it's disabling. If you are autistic, you are disabled. And I hope that in the future, we rethink about support needs and disability as it relates to autism. Since at the moment, support is only a legal obligation in certain circumstances, and you'll need a professional, government-accepted diagnosis to qualify for certain supports. But a lot of these supports relate to disabling factors that could apply to anyone. These autistic features are also human features. My mum uses a wheelchair, so needs a ramp to access some public buildings. But putting a ramp in would also be helpful for people with reduced mobility that struggle to use stairs. It's not the wheelchair that creates the right for the accommodation, in the same way that the autism diagnosis paperwork shouldn't be required for certain accommodations. Like written instructions at work, rather than verbal ones, to allow you extra processing time. It should be someone has a support need, and that need can be addressed without an entire person having to be diagnosed with something. Am I right? And there you have it. 40 reasons that you, or someone you know, might not be autistic. Remember, this isn't a checklist, and no single reason defines anything. Autism is a complex condition, and autistic traits are human traits. But if any of these reasons sound familiar, it could be a good time to explore why that might be. And there are many videos on my channel where you can start. Maybe? Maybe? So what do you think? If you made it this far in the video, leave your favourite emoji in the comment section below. But no broccoli, please. I hear it might be curing autism. No, fake news. That was last week's video where I talked about some claims made by the doctor, Dr. Michael Greger, about curing autism or treating autism. Hot takes, huh? And if you like this video, please hit that like button, stim the subscribe button, and share it with anyone who might need it. And I'll see you next time. Take care, everyone. Bye.